There is a question buried inside one of the most famous stories ever told, and almost nobody stops long enough to ask it. The man who climbed the mountain and came back down with the law of God written on stone. The man whose name is synonymous with divine commandment, with holy covenant, with the very idea that God speaks to human beings and expects to be obeyed. That man had killed someone, not in battle, not as a soldier following orders, not in the heat of a war that history would later justify. He walked up to another man, looked around to make sure no one was watching, struck him down, and buried the body in the sand. That is the man God chose. Not despite that history, not by overlooking it, not by pretending it did not happen. The murder, the flight, the 40 years of hiding, the failure of nerve, and the crisis of identity, all of it was part of the making of the person who would stand before the most powerful empire in the world and say, on behalf of a God that empire did not recognize, "Let my people go." This is not a comfortable story. It was never meant to be. The Bible does not clean Moses up. It does not smooth the edges or skip the difficult chapters. It presents him whole, the prince and the fugitive, the prophet and the man who struck the rock in anger, the one who spoke with God face to face, and the one who was not permitted to enter the land he had spent 40 years walking toward. To understand why God chose this particular man, you have to understand what Moses actually was, all of it, not the version that fits neatly onto a Sunday school wall, the full version, the one that makes you ask hard questions about what God is actually doing when he chooses someone. This is that story. Before we can understand Moses, we have to understand the world he was born into, because the world Moses entered was not a world of possibility. It was a world designed, with deliberate and systematic cruelty, to eliminate him. The year is somewhere around 1526 BC. Egypt is the dominant civilization of the ancient world. Its pyramids have already been standing for 1,000 years. Its pharaohs are considered gods, literally, not metaphorically. The divine authority of the pharaoh was not a political claim, it was a theological one. To defy Pharaoh was to defy the cosmic order. To challenge his decrees was to challenge the structure of reality itself. And inside this empire, living in a region called Goshen, in the eastern Nile Delta, is a population of people who are not Egyptian. They are Hebrews' descendants of a man named Jacob, whose grandfather Abraham had received a promise from a God named Yahweh that his descendants would inherit a land of their own. That promise was now roughly 400 years old, and the people waiting for it were not living in a land, they were building one for someone else. The story of how they got there is important. Several generations earlier, a young Hebrew named Joseph had been sold into slavery by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, traded to a caravan of merchants, and eventually transported to Egypt. What followed was a sequence of events so improbable that the biblical text frames them explicitly as the hidden movement of God through circumstances that looked, at every stage, like catastrophe. Joseph was falsely accused, imprisoned, forgotten, and then, through a dream that Pharaoh could not interpret, and that Joseph could, he was elevated in a single day from prison to palace, made second in command over the entire Egyptian empire. When famine struck the ancient Near East, Egypt was the only nation with food. Joseph's management of the surplus had prepared for exactly this. His family, his brothers, his father, the entire household of Israel came to Egypt looking for grain and found something more than they expected. They were welcomed, given land, given status, given the protection of the house that Joseph had served. For a generation, it was good. Then things changed in the way things always change, when the memory of a debt fades. Exodus chapter 1 records it with a phrase that carries enormous weight for such a small number of words. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. It is easy to read past that sentence. It sounds like a bureaucratic transition, a change of administration. But what it describes is something far more consequential. This new king had no loyalty to the arrangement. He had inherited an empire, and inside that empire was a foreign population that had been growing for generations. Exodus says they had become exceedingly numerous. And Pharaoh looked at them and saw not people. He saw a threat. His response was the response of frightened power throughout human history. He enslaved them. He put them to work on his building projects, the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses, monuments to Egyptian glory built on Hebrew backs. He made their lives harsh. He appointed taskmasters to crush any sense of dignity or agency. And when that was not enough, when the population continued to grow despite everything, he did something worse. He ordered the death of every newborn Hebrew boy. The instruction went first to the midwives. The text names them Shiphrah and Puah. It names them, which is worth noting, because Pharaoh is not named in this part of the narrative. The most powerful man in the world, the god-king of Egypt, goes unnamed. The women who defied him get their names preserved. They told Pharaoh the Hebrew women gave birth too quickly. The babies arrived before the midwives could get there. The text says God dealt well with the midwives because they feared God rather than Pharaoh. It is a quiet, embedded statement about the hierarchy of authority that will run through the entire story of Moses. When the midwives' resistance became known, Pharaoh escalated. The decree went to all his people. Every son born to the Hebrews was to be thrown into the Nile. It was into this world, this specific, calculated, systematic attempt to eliminate an entire people through the murder of their male children, that Moses was born. His mother's name was Jochebed. His father's name was Amram. They were from the tribe of Levi. And when their son was born, Exodus says simply that she saw he was a beautiful child and hid him for 3 months. There is enormous weight in that sentence. She saw he was beautiful. The Hebrew word carries connotations beyond physical appearance. It suggests something set apart, something marked. Later, Jewish tradition and the New Testament book of Hebrews both make much of this. But at the level of a mother holding a newborn in a country where that baby's life had been declared forfeit, what the text preserves is not a theological statement. It is a human one. She looked at her child and could not do what the empire required. For 3 months, she hid him. Every morning she woke up and made the same choice. Not today. She could not keep making that choice indefinitely. The baby was growing. The sounds he made were growing. The risk of discovery was growing. So she made a different choice. She took papyrus reeds and constructed a small basket, waterproofed it with tar and pitch, and placed her son in it. Then she set it among the reeds at the edge of the Nile, the same river into which Pharaoh had commanded Hebrew boys be thrown. The irony is precise, and it does not appear to be accidental. The instrument of death becomes the instrument of salvation. The decree was to throw the children into the Nile. Jochebed did, technically, put her child in the Nile. But she had put him in a vessel first. His sister, later identified as Miriam, stood at a distance to watch what would happen. What happened was improbable by any ordinary measure. Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe at that part of the river. She saw the basket. She sent her servant to retrieve it. She opened it, saw the baby crying, and had compassion on him. She recognized immediately that this was a Hebrew child. There was no question about that. She knew exactly what her father's decree said, and she chose, in that moment, to defy it. Midian, watching from the reeds, stepped forward and asked the princess if she wanted a Hebrew nurse for the child. The princess said yes. Midian brought Jochebed, and Moses' own mother was hired, paid wages by the house of Pharaoh, to nurse the very child that house had condemned to death. When the child was old enough, Jochebed brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. He became her son. She named him Moses, drawn from the water. And he grew up in the palace. Think about what this means in practical terms. Moses received an Egyptian royal education. He was trained in the full knowledge of Egyptian culture, religion, administration, and power. He knew how the empire worked from the inside. He knew its language, its protocols, its weaknesses, its pressure points. He knew the structure of its bureaucracy and the psychology of its ruling class. He was, for all external purposes, a prince of Egypt. And underneath all of that, in whatever private space his memory and his identity occupied, he knew he was Hebrew. Moses was grown when it happened. The text in Exodus chapter 2 says he went out to his people and looked at their burdens. That phrase, went out to his people, is deliberate. He had a choice about whether to go. He went, and he saw. What he saw was an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. The text gives us no additional context. We do not know what the beating was for. We do not know how severe it was. We do not know if Moses had seen things like this before and turned away. What we know is what he did. He looked around. The text is explicit about this. He looked this way and that, saw no one, and struck the Egyptian down. Then he hid the body in the sand. This moment is uncomfortable for obvious reasons. The man who will receive the commandment, "You shall not murder," the man whose name is attached to the law that forms the ethical foundation of 3 of the world's great religions, committed murder. Before he was a lawgiver, he was a killer. Various attempts have been made across the centuries to soften this. Some have argued that Moses was defending the Hebrew slave, that what he did was an act of justice rather than violence. Others have pointed out that the Egyptian was himself engaged in violence, that the situation was not morally equivalent. These observations are not wrong, but they also do not change what the text records. Moses killed a man. He looked around to see if anyone was watching before he did it, and he hid the body. That sequence, the looking around, the checking for witnesses, the concealment, is not the behavior of a man acting in clear conscience. It is the behavior of a man who knows he has done something that cannot be undone and is trying to contain the consequences. The next day, Moses went out again. He saw 2 Hebrews fighting each other. He intervened. One of them turned on him. "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out, or at least it was not as secret as Moses had thought. The text says Moses was afraid. When Pharaoh heard about it, he sought to kill Moses, and Moses fled. He fled Egypt. He fled the palace where he had been raised. He fled the people he had tried, in his own violent and unilateral way, to help. He fled across the Sinai desert and ended up in a region called Midian, east of Egypt, where he sat down by a well and helped some shepherd girls water their flocks and was taken in by their father, a priest named Jethro. He married one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah. He had a son. And then he tended sheep for 40 years. 40 years. This is not a rounding number or a symbolic approximation in this context. It is a generation. Moses was 40 years old when he fled Egypt. He was 80 years old when he went back. Everything he had been in Egypt, the education, the palace connections, the position, the identity of a prince, none of it was available to him in Midian. He was a fugitive. He was a shepherd in a foreign country. He had a family, and presumably a life of some kind, but it was a life of radical diminishment compared to what he had left behind. The ambitions of a prince, if he had had them, were buried somewhere in the sand of Sinai. The impulse that had led him to take matters into his own hands, to see injustice and strike back at it, had led him to a desert. It is tempting to read these 40 years as wasted time, as a long detour, as the gap between what Moses might have been and what he eventually became. But the structure of the story suggests something different. The desert years were not parenthetical. They were formative. A man who spent 40 years tending sheep in the Sinai wilderness knew that wilderness. He knew its terrain, its water sources, its danger, its scale. He knew how to move a large group of animals through a landscape that provided almost nothing. He knew how to find food and water where none was apparent. He knew how to navigate by landmarks that most people would not have noticed. He knew the psychology of creatures that were simultaneously helpless and stubborn, that needed to be led rather than driven, that would panic easily and wander lethally if not managed with patience. He was being trained for something without knowing it. He was also being stripped of something. The man who had looked this way and that before striking the Egyptian, the man who had acted on impulse, who had believed that his own strength and judgment were sufficient to solve a problem that man was being slowly, thoroughly disassembled by 4 decades of anonymity, dependence, and the particular humility that comes from being nobody in a landscape that does not care who you used to be. The desert does not keep scores. It does not remember palace educations. It does not care about the names of the people your adoptive grandmother employed. It simply presents itself, day after day, in its vast, indifferent scale, and asks what you are actually made of. By the time Moses was 80 years old, he appears to have concluded that the answer to that question was, not much. This, it turns out, was exactly the right answer. The mountain is called Horeb. It is also called Sinai. It is the same mountain the names are used interchangeably in the text, and scholars have debated for centuries which specific peak in the Sinai Peninsula it corresponds to. What the text is clear about is that this particular mountain had a character in the biblical narrative. It was where things happened between God and human beings, where theophanies occurred, where the distance between heaven and earth became, in some way, that the text never fully explains, thinner. Moses was on the far side of the wilderness with Jethro's flock when he saw it, a bush that was on fire. That alone was not remarkable. The dry scrub of the Sinai could ignite easily in the heat. What stopped Moses was that the bush kept burning without being consumed. The fire was there. The fire was real, but the bush was not burning up. He turned aside to look. That phrase is worth staying with. Moses was 80 years old. He had been a fugitive for 40 years. He was a shepherd who had, by every outward measure, made peace with the smallness of his life. He did not have to turn aside. He could have kept walking, kept managing the flock, kept moving through another ordinary day in a long sequence of ordinary days. But he turned aside to look. And God spoke from the fire. The first thing God said was Moses' name, twice. Moses, Moses. The repetition is a pattern throughout the biblical narrative. It appears when God calls to Abraham on Mount Moriah, when he speaks to Jacob in a dream, when he calls Samuel in the temple. It is not just an attention getter. It is an address. It is the sound of being fully seen by something that sees fully. Moses said, "Here I am." What followed was a commissioning unlike anything in the biblical narrative before it. God identified himself, not as a generic divine power, not as the God of Egypt or the God of a mountain, but specifically, precisely, as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He was invoking a history. He was claiming continuity with promises made to specific people in specific places across specific centuries. And then he said something that illuminates everything that had been happening in Egypt during Moses' absence. "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them." This is one of the most theologically dense passages in the entire Old Testament. God says, He has seen, He has heard, He is concerned, He has come down. These are not the words of a distant deity monitoring events from an unreachable remove. They are the words of a God who is present to suffering, who is moved by it, who has been watching and listening for the entirety of those 400 years of slavery, and who is now announcing that the watching and listening is about to become something else. And then he says, "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses' response is one of the most remarkably honest moments in all of Scripture. He does not say yes. He does not fall on his face in awe and pledge himself to the mission. He says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" On the surface, this reads like false modesty, like the kind of ritualized humility that leaders perform when they are about to accept a great commission. But when you read it in context, when you understand that Moses is 80 years old, that he has spent 40 years as a fugitive shepherd, that the last time he tried to help his people he killed a man and had to run, it is not modesty. It is a genuine question. Who am I? The answer he himself would give is, a man who failed catastrophically the last time I tried to act, a man who is old, a man who is nobody. God's response does not answer the question. He does not tell Moses who Moses is. He says, I will be with you. This is not a small distinction. Moses asked about his own adequacy. God answered by pointing to his own presence. The conversation that follows is one of the most extended negotiations in the Bible, and it is worth reading as exactly that, a negotiation, not a capitulation. Moses raises objection after objection. What if they ask your name? What if they don't believe me? What if they won't listen? I am not a good speaker. I have never been eloquent, and this has not changed since you began speaking to me. Each objection is real. Each one reflects genuine uncertainty about whether this mission is possible. And God answers each one, not with reassurance that Moses is up to the task, but with specific provisions that compensate for every specific limitation Moses identifies. You need to know my name? My name is I am who I am. You need signs to establish your credibility? Here are 3: a staff that becomes a snake, a hand that becomes leprous and then heals, water from the Nile that turns to blood on dry ground. You can't speak? Your brother Aaron can speak for you. He will be your mouth. There is one moment in this exchange that is worth particular attention. After all of Moses' objections have been answered, after God has provided a name, signs, and a spokesman, Moses says something that the text frames differently from all his previous objections. He says, "Please, Lord, send someone else." The text says God's anger burned against Moses, not because Moses was afraid, not because Moses doubted his own ability. God's anger burned because Moses, having received answer after answer, was now simply refusing. He did not want to go. Whatever combination of self-awareness, fear, past failure, and 40 years of building a different life had produced in him, it had produced a man who, when confronted with the most significant divine commission in the history of his people, said, "Find someone else." God did not find someone else. He gave Moses Aaron and sent him anyway. Moses and Aaron arrived in Egypt and gathered the elders of Israel. Moses performed the signs God had given him. The people believed. They bowed their heads and worshipped. That moment, which might sound like a triumphant beginning, was about to get considerably worse before it got better. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and delivered the message. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go." Pharaoh's response was immediate and contemptuous. "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then he made things worse for the Israelites. He withdrew the straw that had been provided for making bricks and told them to gather their own while keeping the same daily quota. When they could not meet it, they were beaten. When they appealed to Pharaoh, he told them they were lazy. When they came to Moses, they turned on him. "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses went back to God with a question that sounds remarkably like complaint. "Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." This is the Moses the story keeps showing us. Not the serene prophet of popular imagination, not the man whose faith is unshakable and whose confidence in God never wavers. This is a man who, when the first attempt at liberation made things worse for the people he was trying to help, went back to God and essentially said, "This is not going according to plan." God's response to Moses' complaint is not a rebuke, it is a restatement. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country." What followed was the 10 plagues. The plagues deserve more attention than they typically receive, because they were not simply a demonstration of raw divine power. They were a systematic, theological argument. Egypt was a civilization built on a complex pantheon of gods, and the plagues moved through that pantheon with what looks, in retrospect, like deliberate precision. The Nile turning to blood was not merely an environmental catastrophe. The Nile was the life of Egypt, its agricultural system, its economy, its entire civilizational infrastructure depended on the Nile's annual flooding and its year-round reliability as a water source. But the Nile was also sacred. Hapi, the god of the Nile's inundation, was one of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon. The first plague did not just inconvenience Egypt, it humiliated one of its gods. The frogs came from the Nile. Hecate, the frog goddess, was associated with fertility and childbirth. The frogs that covered every surface of Egypt were not random creatures. They were the sacred animal of a goddess, out of control, everywhere, a source of disgust rather than blessing. The plagues moved through Egypt's theological world like a dismantling. The gnats from the dust Egyptian magicians told Pharaoh this was the finger of God, and for the first time, their own magic failed them. The flies that swarmed everywhere except in Goshen, establishing a distinction that made the theological point unmissable: the death of Egyptian livestock, while Israelite livestock was untouched. The boils that fell on every Egyptian, including the magicians, who could not even stand before Pharaoh because of their own affliction. The hail that destroyed the crops. The locusts that devoured what the hail had left. The darkness that covered Egypt for 3 days, while Goshen had light. Ra, the sun god, was the most important deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Pharaoh himself was considered a son of Ra. 3 days of complete, unbreakable darkness was not a weather event. It was a statement about whether Ra had any actual power over the darkness, and the answer the plague gave was no. And then came the 10th plague. Everything that came before it was a dismantling of Egypt's gods and economy. The 10th plague was different in kind. God told Moses to have every Hebrew household take a lamb on the 10th of Nisan, a male without blemish. Keep it until the 14th. Slaughter it at twilight. Apply the blood to the doorposts and lintel of the house with a branch of hyssop. Roast the lamb and eat it that night in haste, with sandals on, staff in hand, ready to move. The blood would be a sign. When the destroyer passed through Egypt that night, every house marked with blood would be passed over. Every house without the mark would lose its firstborn. The instruction was not about merit. It was not about who deserved to be spared. It was about the blood on the doorpost. The protection was external, applied, specific, and available to anyone who would put it there. That night, a great cry went through Egypt. There was not a house where someone was not dead. Pharaoh rose in the night, called Moses and Aaron, and said, "Go, take your people, and go. Take your flocks and herds. Go, and bless me also." The departure of Israel from Egypt is described in numbers that have been debated by scholars for generations: 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children. Whatever the precise figure, the text communicates that what walked out of Egypt that night was not a small community. It was a nation. A nation that had been slaves for 400 years and was now, in a single night, free. What Pharaoh had experienced, the loss of his firstborn son, the shattering of his economy, the humiliation of his gods, had been enough, in the moment, to break his resistance. But as the shock faded and the reality of what had just happened settled in, a different calculation took over. He had lost his labor force. 600,000 workers, the people who had built his cities, his monuments, his empire, were gone, and he had let them go. He mobilized his army, his chariot forces, the finest military machinery in the ancient world, and he pursued Israel into the wilderness. Israel saw them coming and panicked. They were trapped, the Egyptian army behind them, the Red Sea ahead. The response of the crowd was the response that crowds under existential threat tend to give. They turned on their leader. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Moses' response, in this moment, is one of the most significant in the entire narrative. He does not argue back. He does not remind them of what God has already done. He says, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then God speaks to Moses, and the instruction is not what you might expect. God says, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Why are you crying out to me? It is not a rebuke exactly, but it is a directional instruction. There is a time for prayer and a time for action, and the two are not always the same time. Moses raised his staff. The sea divided. The Israelites walked through on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptian army followed them into the divided sea, and then the waters returned. The army of the most powerful nation on earth was swallowed by the same sea that had just provided a path of escape for the people it was pursuing. The other side of that sea was a completely different world. Not geographically, the Sinai Peninsula was still the Sinai Peninsula. But the people who stepped out of the water on the eastern shore were not the same people who had stepped in from the western shore. They had been slaves. They were now something else. What that something else was going to become was the question the rest of Moses' life would answer. 3 months after leaving Egypt, Israel came to the desert of Sinai. They camped at the base of the same mountain where Moses had seen the burning bush, where God had told him, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." The sign had been given. They were there. What happened on Mount Sinai over the following weeks and months is one of the most architecturally complex sections of the entire Old Testament. The law code delivered there what we know as the Mosaic Law. The Torah covers not just the 10 Commandments, but an extraordinarily detailed body of legislation covering property rights, family law, criminal justice, ritual practice, the design of the tabernacle, the duties of priests, the schedule of feasts, the treatment of workers, the rights of slaves, the regulations governing leprosy, the handling of mold in buildings, the behavior of armies in wartime, the protection of the poor, the treatment of foreigners, and dozens of other domains of human life. This body of law was, for its time, radical. In the ancient Near East, law was typically the property of kings. The Law of Hammurabi, for example, issued roughly 3 centuries before the Mosaic Law was presented as a gift from the king to the people. The king was the source of law. The king could modify it, suspend it, or ignore it for himself. The Mosaic Law was different in a way that had enormous consequences. It was presented not as the law of a king, but as the law of God. And it applied to everyone, including the king, when Israel eventually had one, including the priests, including Moses himself. This democratization of law, this positioning of a divine code as binding on all people, regardless of status, was a genuinely revolutionary development in human legal history. Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights receiving this law. He received the 10 Commandments written by the finger of God on stone tablets. He received detailed instructions for the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that would be the dwelling place of God's presence in the wilderness camp. He received the pattern for the Ark of the Covenant, the golden lampstand, the table for the bread of the presence, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering, the bronze basin, the priestly garments, the rituals of ordination, the calendar of feasts. All of it was being established while Moses was on the mountain. And at the base of the mountain, something else was being established. The people had been waiting at the base of the mountain for 40 days. Moses had gone up and had not come back. They did not know what had happened to him. They did not know if he was alive. What they did know was that they were in a desert, far from Egypt, with no visible leadership and no visible God. The pillar of cloud and fire, the sign of divine presence, was on the mountain with Moses. The camp below was without it. They went to Aaron. "Come, make us gods, who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron's response is one of the most troubling moments in the entire narrative. The man who had been Moses' voice before Pharaoh, who had witnessed every plague, who had watched the sea divide, told the people to bring their gold earrings. He took them, fashioned them with a tool, and made a golden calf. Then he built an altar before it and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." This is not worship of a foreign god. The text does not present it as a straightforward defection to paganism. Aaron calls the feast to the Lord, to Yahweh. What the people made was an image, a visible representation of the invisible God. They had watched Egypt's gods embodied in statues, in animals, in physical representations, and they wanted something they could see. The long tradition of arguing about what exactly went wrong at Sinai is rooted in this ambiguity. What is clear is that God's response was not ambiguous at all. Up on the mountain, God told Moses what was happening below. "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol." The phrasing is careful and important. God says to Moses, "Your people, not my people." Not the phrase that had been used every other time the people God had rescued, the people he had claimed. In this moment, in the middle of this crisis, God creates a relational distance between himself and the people below. What God said next is the most theologically significant moment in Moses' entire life. "Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." Let that settle. God is offering Moses what Abraham was promised. Start over. Let these people go. I will make you the father of a great nation. Your descendants will be the ones who inherit the promise. These people who turned away this quickly, who are down there right now bowing to a gold statue of a calf, these people are finished. Moses could have said yes. He did not. What Moses did in the next few verses is one of the most remarkable acts of intercession in all of Scripture. He argued with God. He made a case for why God should not destroy Israel. He reminded God that these were the people God had brought out of Egypt with great power. He pointed out that the Egyptians would say God had brought them out to kill them in the mountains. He invoked the covenant God had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the oath, the promise, the commitment to multiply their descendants and give them a land. And the text says, "Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened." Moses came down the mountain, carrying the 2 stone tablets. When he heard the noise of the camp and saw what was happening, the golden calf, the dancing, the celebration, his anger burned. He threw the tablets down and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. He burned the calf, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the people drink it. He confronted Aaron. Aaron's explanation is one of the most extraordinary pieces of deflection in the biblical text. He told Moses that the people had given him their gold, and then I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf, as if the calf had formed itself, as if Aaron had been a passive observer to a metallurgical miracle. The consequences of the golden calf were severe. Moses stood at the entrance to the camp and called for whoever was on the Lord's side to come to him. The tribe of Levi gathered around him. He sent them through the camp, and 3,000 people died that day. Then Moses went back up the mountain, and what he said to God there is perhaps the most extraordinary statement he ever made. "Please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. Take me instead. If you won't forgive them, remove me." This is not Moses negotiating for his own survival. This is Moses offering his own existence in exchange for the people who had just proven in the most concrete way possible that they did not deserve him. God did not accept the exchange. He told Moses that he would deal with sin in his own way and in his own time. But he also told Moses to lead the people on to the land he had promised. The covenant was repaired. New tablets were made. The story continued. Between the giving of the law and the edge of the promised land lies 40 years of wilderness, and in those 40 years, Moses carries something that no leadership manual has ever fully described. He carries 1 million people who have never governed themselves. He carries their complaints, their rebellions, their diseases, their disputes, their nostalgia for Egypt. He carries the weight of being the intermediary between a holy God and a people who, at any given moment, might be worshiping something they made themselves. There are moments in the wilderness narrative that show Moses at the edge of what a human being can hold. Numbers chapter 11 records one of them. The people are complaining again, this time about the food. They are tired of the manna. They want meat. They want the fish they used to eat in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. What they had in slavery looks better to them in memory than what they have in freedom. Moses' response to God in this moment is raw and unguarded in a way that is almost shocking. Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you, that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms, as a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors? I cannot carry all these people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. Please go ahead and kill me. This is Moses, the great prophet, the lawgiver, the man who spoke with God face to face, as a man speaks with his friend. And he has reached a point where death looks better than another day of carrying these people. God's response is practical and compassionate. He tells Moses to gather 70 elders who will share the burden of leadership. He will distribute the spirit that is on Moses to them. Moses will not have to carry it alone. And then, and this detail is easy to miss, when 2 of the 70 begin prophesying outside the camp rather than at the tent of meeting, Joshua comes to Moses and says, "Stop them." Joshua, the young assistant who would one day succeed him, stood up in a moment of fierce loyalty. He wanted to protect Moses' unique status, to keep his authority singular and undisputed. But Moses' response was one of the most generous acts of leadership in history. "Are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his spirit on them." In this moment, we see a Moses who has completely dismantled the ego of the Egyptian prince he once was. He was no longer interested in a monopoly on divine access or power. He understood that he was a bridge, a man preparing a people for a future he would not be part of. While Joshua was trying to protect the man, Moses was protecting the mission. This humility was the key that allowed him to carry a stiff-necked nation for 40 years without succumbing to the weight of his own importance. 40 years into the wilderness, the people are at a place called Kadesh. There is no water. They gather against Moses and Aaron. The complaint is familiar. It has happened before, will happen again. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Moses and Aaron go to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fall face down. The glory of God appears to them. God speaks to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water." The instruction is clear. Speak to the rock. Moses takes the staff. He gathers the assembly before the rock. And then he says something that tells us 40 years of cumulative weight has become something else. "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Must we bring you water? We Moses and Aaron, not God." And then he strikes the rock twice with his staff, instead of speaking to it as commanded. Water comes out. The people drink. Their livestock drink. The crisis is resolved. And then God says something that changes the end of Moses' story permanently. Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this congregation into the land I give them. Moses, who has shepherded this people for 40 years through the wilderness, who has interceded for them, argued for them, carried them, suffered for them, Moses will not enter the promised land. He struck the rock instead of speaking to it. He said "we" when he should have given the credit to God. He acted in anger, in the sight of the people, in a way that obscured the holiness of the God who was providing the water. The punishment seems disproportionate by human standards, and perhaps that is part of the point. The closer you are to the source of holiness, the more precisely you are held to it. Moses had been given a level of access, a level of intimacy with God that no one else in the entire narrative had received. The words he spoke in front of the people carried a weight that ordinary words did not carry. When he took credit that belonged to God, the effect of that misattribution was not small. He would die on the eastern side of the Jordan. He would see the land, but he would not enter it. Moses is 120 years old. The 40 years of wilderness are ending. A new generation, the children of the generation that came out of Egypt, most of whom died in the wilderness because of their repeated faithlessness, is standing on the plains of Moab, ready to cross the Jordan. Moses gives his final speeches. The book of Deuteronomy is Moses' farewell address, or rather, 3 of them, delivered on consecutive days to the assembled people of Israel. He rehearses everything that has happened. He restates the law. He renews the covenant. He warns of what will happen if they abandon God. He promises what will happen when they return. He speaks with a directness and urgency that has the quality of a man who knows he is running out of time. He teaches them a song. He blesses each tribe. He does everything he can think of to prepare a people for a future he will not be part of. And then God tells him to go up Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah and look out across the land. From the mountain, Moses can see it. The whole of the promised land from Gilead to Dan, from Naphtali to Ephraim and Manasseh, from the Negev to the western sea, the Jordan Valley, Jericho, the Palm City. He sees it. He will not enter it. Deuteronomy records the end with a simplicity that is almost unbearable. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day no one knows where his grave is. God buried him. No one knows where. There is no tomb. There is no monument. There is no site of pilgrimage. The man who was the greatest prophet Israel ever had, who spoke to God face to face, who led a nation out of slavery, who mediated the covenant, who stood as intercessor between a holy God and an unholy people, is buried in an unmarked grave in a foreign country. He was 120 years old. His eyes were not weak. His strength had not failed. And God buried him. We are now in a position to answer the question the title of this video asked. Why did God choose a murderer to write the law? The comfortable answer is that God can use anyone, that no one is beyond redemption, that God specializes in unlikely choices. These things are true, and they are not wrong, but they are not the full answer. The full answer requires us to look at what Moses actually was, the specific combination of formation, failure, experience, and brokenness that made him the person who could do what needed to be done. Consider what the role required. It required someone who knew the interior of Egyptian power, who understood the psychology of a pharaoh, the protocols of a palace, the pressure points of an empire. That knowledge came from 40 years of being raised as Egyptian royalty. It could not have come any other way. It required someone who knew the wilderness, not abstractly, not as a concept or a map, someone who knew where water could be found in the Sinai, how to move a large group of living creatures through a landscape that provided almost nothing, how to navigate by landmarks that most eyes would pass over. That knowledge came from 40 years of tending sheep in exactly the wilderness Israel would spend 40 years crossing. It required someone who had been stripped of self-reliance, who had tried, once, to solve a problem in his own strength, on his own initiative, with his own judgment, and had produced a catastrophe, who had spent 40 years in a desert, learning that the gap between who he thought he was and who he actually was could only be bridged by a God whose name was I Am. It required someone who could be broken by the weight of leadership without being destroyed by it, who could say to God, "Please, go ahead and kill me," and wake up the next morning and still be leading. Who could intercede so completely for a people that he offered his own existence for theirs? It required someone who was acquainted with failure at the deepest level, not the superficial failures of effort or execution, but the failure that calls into question everything you thought you were. The failure that sends you into 40 years of hiding. The failure you cannot undo or explain away. It required someone who knew what it was to be nobody, to be a fugitive, to be a man whose past had disqualified him from everything he might have claimed. None of that was accidental. None of it was incidental to the mission. The murder, the flight, the years of obscurity, the meeting at the burning bush, these were not obstacles that God worked around. They were the making of the man. The murderer did not write the law despite having murdered. He wrote it because the full weight of human capacity for violence and failure and self-deception had passed through him personally, and he had emerged on the other side as a man who knew, with a precision that could not be taught, why such a law was necessary. In the 15th chapter of Deuteronomy, near the end of Moses' farewell address, he says something that the New Testament later picks up with enormous significance. He says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. A prophet like me." Moses is announcing, in his final days, that what he has been is not the final word, that the pattern he embodies, the mediator between God and people, the one who stands in the gap, the intercessor who speaks for the people to God and God's words to the people, that pattern is not completed in him. It is pointing forward. The New Testament is emphatic about where it points. Hebrews chapter 3 compares Moses and Jesus directly and carefully. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house. Jesus was faithful as a son over God's house. Moses was a witness to what would be said in the future. Jesus was the future that Moses witnessed. Moses died on the eastern side of the Jordan. Jesus died outside Jerusalem. But unlike Moses, what happened 3 days after that death did not end with an unmarked grave. The prophet, like Moses, came, and when he came, one of the things that happened in a scene on a mountain that the text calls the Transfiguration was that Moses appeared after 14 centuries on a mountain talking with Jesus. The man who had been buried in an unmarked grave in Moab stood on the mountain of glory, in the presence of the one his own life had been pointing toward. The law was not the end of the story. The lawgiver was not the fulfillment. Moses himself knew that. He said so on the plains of Moab, looking out over a land he would never enter, speaking to a people he would never lead across the Jordan. A prophet like me. You must listen to him. He had spent 80 years becoming the man who could say that, and it was perhaps the most important thing he ever said. The story of Moses is not just ancient history. It is a mirror. It reminds us that your scars, your mistakes, and your desert years are not wasted. They are the very materials God uses to build the person you were destined to become. Moses emerged from the shadow of a murderer to become the friend of God not by his own strength, but through the power of surrender. If this journey into the life of the lawgiver has helped you see your own failures in a new light, please share it. There is someone in your life who needs to know that their past does not define their future when it is placed in the hands of the great I Am. Don't forget to subscribe as we continue to go deep into the stories of kings, prophets, and ordinary people who carried the weight of the world. We explore these texts because they deserve our attention, and because you deserve to see the full picture. The story is still being told, and you are a part of it.